Hello and welcome back to Women's Business Voice. My name is Angela De Souza and I'm your host, and we are featuring a very special series entitled From Side Hustles to Empires, Histories of Working Women's Lives, where we are featuring a series of conversations between Dr. Amy Edwards and a range of expert historians. In this series, we explore the relationship between gender, work, and career in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, asking what's new and what isn't about the nature of working women's lives in Britain. The series will explore not only the success stories of famous entrepreneurs and business leaders, but also hidden stories of women who've made a living in systems and structures not often designed with them in mind. This week's episode is entitled When I Grow Up, a history of careers advice, and our special guest is Dr. Hannah Charnock from the University of Bristol. So let's dive in. Over to you, Amy.
Okay, so everyone, last episode we were looking at social mobility, and particularly how changes in society after World War II affected women's experiences of work and family, also a bit of education. And this episode we're going to be taking a closer look at some of those changes, but from the perspective particularly of young women and teenage girls. We'll be thinking a bit about what they were taught at schools, what did they imagine life after might be like, and what pathways to employment were open to them. And we're especially lucky today to be joined by my very excellent and wonderful colleague here at the University of Bristol, Dr. Hannah Charnock, who's going to hopefully talk to us a little bit about careers advice for young women. Before we get into that, just because I know her well doesn't mean that everyone else shouldn't get the pleasure of getting to know more about Hannah, so I'll do a brief introduction. Hannah is a lecturer, like I say, here at Bristol, where she studies the history of young people and relationships. Her book, which you should totally go out and buy, is out now, is called Teenage Intimacies, Young Women, Sex and Social Life in England from 1950 to 1980. It came out earlier this year, and it really tells us about the role of like friends, boyfriends, parents, teenagers, all the people that made up young women's lives and kind of informed how they understood and experienced sex in the 1960s and 70s in particular. She also has a new project which she's developing at the moment, which is about school life. Again, thinking more about the relationships that make up our time at school, and the history of how some of that stuff has kind of changed. So basically, she's perfectly placed to talk to us today about the working lives of young women, particularly in relation to how they kind of thought about and imagined work while they were in education. So thank you very much for joining us, Hannah. Did I miss anything out
No, that was
important?
great.
Lovely job. We can kind of crack on, but I know I did a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what you're working on at the moment and your book. But I actually wondered if you could start by just telling us a bit more about you as a historian. How did you come to be interested in young people's lives and relationships?
I mainly got here through wanting to think about the history of sexuality and thinking about the place of romantic relationships and sexuality in the way that women experience their lives and their like societies and their communities. Um, so before I did my PhD, I had done some work on like the history of abortion. I'd done some work on the history of marriage. My PhD was originally supposed to be a history of contraception and kind of family planning practices. But once I started doing that research, I became particularly interested in young women and young women's experiences of contraception and family planning. So if you take the idea of like the sexual revolution in the 1960s, young women are often really important in the imagery of that. Like if we think about the imagery of the sexual revolution, we think about like mini skirts and dolly birds. And the idea that you can like now suddenly have sex before marriage because the pill means that you don't have to worry about getting pregnant. So that kind of imagery is really powerful, but I didn't necessarily feel like we had a very good sense of actually how sexuality was playing out in young people's lives. And so like the PhD project and then the book project were looking at that in much more depth. And I suppose the way that I then came to thinking about education and thinking about careers and like, yeah, all of that element of teenage experience came from kind of wanting to know where girls' sense of or their kind of feelings about sexuality were imbued with a kind of future time perspective. So what girls thought and how they tried to like manage their sexuality in the present was often really powerfully informed by like the futures that they imagined for themselves. And that one of the things that happens in the mid 20th century is that new working cultures, new cultures of education mean that the kind of the trajectories that girls think they will be moving along in their late teens, early 20s into their 30s are subtly different, or sometimes quite different from those of previous generations. And what that in turn means is that how girls thought about their fertility changed, like the impact that getting pregnant would have on your life at the age of 16 or 17 is quite different if you imagine that your primary role in society is to get married and have babies, compared to if you have a vision of your future in which you want to, you know, fully go through the education system and then get a degree and go, you know, experience training so that you can do, you know, become a professional in a particular career. So kind of thinking about the ways in which girls' sexuality and education and understandings of work all kind of like fed into this idea of like, what does your future look like, and how do you at 15 or 16 try and map out what you think your life is gonna look like long term.
This is really timely, I guess, because we're at that time of year where lots of young people are getting their results and are doing exactly that kind of forward imagining. And it's interesting, really, I suppose, because like being a historian is so much about thinking about the past, but of course, the people that we study are all people, much like, you know, like ourselves, who are often imagining a future for themselves. Or something that I often talk about with my students when we talk about education is also that education is a societal vision of the future. The things that you decide that people need to learn when they're young are often about what you think they're going to be doing for society when they're older, whether that's like working or contributing to politics or like political debate. But I mean, you're the expert in this more than me. So I wondered if actually you could give us a bit of a basic history of education in the kind of mid to late 20th century. What is education for? Like, what do people think it's about? Who gets educated? How long do they get educated? Like, what does that look like, and how does it start to change as we move kind of towards the present?
Yeah, so I think it's worth saying that like education is highly politically charged across the 20th century, like exactly like you're saying. It is kind of deeply invested in a sense of kind of what is our country, what are our values, what do we see our kind of collective future to be. Education forms a really important pillar of the welfare state, and the kind of discussions and the politicking that goes on around that, like raises all kinds of questions about like what is the role of the state for, you know, what should the role of the state be in the lives of individuals. I guess in terms of thinking about the relationship between education and work, and more specifically about like careers advice, there are maybe like three changes that are like three areas of change that it's kind of most important for us to acknowledge. So the first is that over the course of the 20th century, like the young people of subsequent generations spend more and more of their lives at school. Like education comes to take on a kind of bigger proportion of your life. So in the late 19th century, kind of 1880s, there are kind of government mandates, like that legislation is passed, which dictates that all children should experience elementary education up to the age of 11 and then 12. So basically what we would now think of as primary school level education. In 1918, that is expanded so that you're kind of expected to be at school between the ages of 5 and 14. In the 1940s, that then gets raised to 15. In the 1970s, that gets raised to 16. And then it kind of stays there, actually, like the school leaving age stays at 16 until the 2010s, when kind of new legislation is passed, which dictates that young people have to be in either education or training until the age of 18. So one of these important changes is that like the amount of time that you are in school is expanding. But I think it's also really interesting to note that it's not just like literally how long, but like which part of like the life course you are in school for. So I suppose in the 19th century, the idea was that education was associated with children, like quite specifically like children. Whereas what happens as the age increases is that education becomes associated with youth much more broadly, which is complicated because certainly in British society, what we understand youth to be has, yes, often included ideas of education and learning, but has also involved the idea of kind of growing up into work, acquiring kind of technical professional skills, thinking about like going through puberty and adolescence, and then what that means for sexuality and kind of families. So we've got this expanding age experience. The second big area of change is in the types of school that young people went to. It's worth saying here that private schools exist throughout this period, but are a kind of minority experience. So we'll slightly leave those to one side for now. But in short, in 1944, a major education bill was passed that was considered to be, like I say, like part of the welfare state, like the construction of the welfare state. And there are lots of motivations behind this, but I guess fundamentally it's developed under the premise that like it's beneficial for everyone to have more than just an elementary education. And more specifically, it's good for society, and it's good for the economy to make sure that people, like young people with educational potential, are encouraged to like reach their full potential. So we have a school system which is allowing students to kind of reach their full potential. So the 1944 Education Act sets out a structure for secondary education in which the most academically gifted students go to grammar schools, a very tiny minority go into technical schools, and then the vast majority of other young people go into what were called secondary modern schools. So it's a schooling system, or a system for secondary education that was nominally at least divided on kind of educational ability. And that's a pretty substantial change, like that impetus for everybody to have a certain level of secondary education is really important. But pretty quickly, like it becomes apparent that for all of this talk of like meritocracy and the idea of people's place in the education system being determined by their own abilities, like pretty quickly that starts to be critiqued on the basis that this tripartite system, this three-part system, largely entrenched existing social divisions. So like there were definitely exceptions. It was definitely possible, and many working class kids were able to get into grammar schools. But in general, when you looked across the system as a whole, grammar schools remained kind of the preserve of elites. Like they remained very middle class institutions. And so the idea that they were somehow this amazing vehicle for social mobility is proved to not quite bear out. So from the late 1950s, heading into the 1960s, you get this move towards comprehensivization, which is about education for all. And so not only do comprehensive schools bring students, or like students from a kind of similar locality, similar area, all together regardless of their background, to kind of do school together. Another really important change that happens with once you get the rise of comprehensive schools is that most comprehensive schools were co-educational, which meant that boys and girls were being taught together, which was not always the case under the grammar school system. And you still see that now, like many of the single-sex schools still have that kind of language of grammar schools attached to them, for example. So yeah, the time you're in school is getting longer. The type of school that you're going to will be different depending on when you were growing up in the 20th century. And then the final change that it's worth mentioning relates to the importance of like exams and like formal educational qualifications. I don't think we need to get fully into the weeds in all of the ins and outs of different qualification types. But I guess in short, the story is that over the course of the 20th century, it becomes increasingly common, partly because people are in school for longer, but also seen as increasingly important that young people leave school with externally recognised qualifications. So early that would be the school certificate, then you get GCSE, kind of O-levels, and then kind of GCSEs and A-levels. So I guess those are the kind of big structural changes that we kind of need to understand if we want to think a little bit about how that relationship between education and work changes over time.
That's all like super interesting. And I guess, I mean, immediately, takes me back to some of my own schooling experiences, although they were not obviously in the 1950s and 60s, but even so, like kind of thinking about how I experienced some of what that looked like and had maybe changed by the 80s. I was in school in the 90s. What am I talking about? But I guess the question, as you say, for us in particular on this podcast, then is what did that look like for young women? Like, what did those changes mean for them, and particularly how did that relate to the kinds of careers advice they were maybe getting, or the kinds of subjects that they were doing, how they were in theory being prepared for life after school? What did that look like for women, or how was that gendered, I guess?
Yeah, so in terms of how was that gendered, I guess one thing that's worth saying is, so we're talking about how like grammar schools entrenched social divisions. So one of those, like I was saying, is like class. The other one is gender. So there were always more places, like grammar school places for boys than there were for girls. So if you ask anyone of kind of that generation about their experience, they will often tell you about, so the test that was used to determine which type of school that you would go to was known as the 11 plus. If you passed the 11 plus, you were eligible to go to grammar school. If you didn't, you would go to secondary modern school. But because there were inherently more places for boys, what that meant is that you could be a girl and you could pass the 11 plus, but that didn't necessarily automatically translate into a place at a grammar school, or you might find it more difficult to get into a grammar school, and then that could have consequences for the kinds of careers advice you were exposed to, the attitudes towards education, the amount of support that you got, the expectations as to how long you would stay in school, compared, like they could be quite different between grammar schools and secondary modern schools. In terms of thinking about the subjects that students studied, like, yes, like they were quite gendered. So before we had GCSEs, the kind of precursor to that were O-levels. And I've managed to dig out some statistics from 1975, which suggests that, so in 1975, 99% of those who passed the cookery O-level and 72% of those who passed sociology were girls, compared to like 99% of passes in design technology and 78% of those in physics were gained by boys. And really interestingly, although perhaps not surprisingly, you also see that follow through from school to university. So like looking at higher education, so university level study, again in the mid 1970s, women make up the vast majority of like students studying education, arts, languages, and literature. but they make up like less than 5% of the student body studying engineering. They're less than a third of those studying sciences. And even within the sciences, it's quite like that number fudges quite a lot between kind of biology and natural sciences compared to like physics and chemistry. And I suppose, like, if we want to know why that is, like, fundamentally, this kind of comes down to differences in how people understood, like, what is education for? Like, what is the point of education? And to put it really bluntly, like, basically, like, when the general understanding is that women's primary function in society is to get married, have babies, and then raise and support their families, many people, like, throughout the 20th century, like, questioned the point of educating girls, and in particular, like, particularly questioned the point of educating them in overtly vocational subjects at higher levels. So what you see is that not only informed the way that many girls, or that educators spoke to girls about their education when they were in schools, but it also translated into vocational training as well. So lots of employers and commentators in the kind of 1960s, 1970s would make the argument that, you know, these young women were leaving school at 15, then 16. It might take them, say, a year or two to do training. So, for example, if you wanted to become a secretary, you'd like leave school at 15, you might then go and do a college course where you learn shorthand and typing and kind of other important like secretarial skills. You would then enter the workforce, you know, a particular business that you go into. It might take you 6 months or a year to kind of get used to the role and become comfortable and become kind of highly proficient at it. But then within 4 or 5 years, it was highly likely that you would get married, that you would have children, and that at that point you would leave the workforce. So employers see kind of training women as a wasted investment, or a potentially wasted investment that they only ever see like really limited returns on. And again, it's important here to, I guess, to like caveat that this like was not all women. Like some women did manage to make it into like very highly successful careers. One of the really interesting things in particular is that women have particular success in entering like professions. So careers like medicine, veterinary science, even to a certain extent, like the law, like in some like those quote unquote like elite professions, in some ways it's much easier for women to enter, I suppose, partly because the route there is education and kind of increasing qualifications. But in general, when you like look across the big picture, these kind of really gendered understandings about what were the roles of men and women into society were clearly filtering down into expectations of work, which then clearly filtered like kind of informed approaches to education.
I mean, that makes loads of sense, and the moment you say it kind of feels immediately obvious, but to hear you kind of lay it out like that is quite stark, I suppose, in terms of how young women's lives were already being imagined or curtailed in some ways, but not before they'd begun. They were obviously living their lives as young people, but before they had even kind of perhaps thought that much themselves about what they might want to do for the rest of their lives. People are already imagining that for them. We've probably got a few moments left, so I just wondered if there was anything in particular about how this filtered down into kind of what careers advice look like what actual occupations young women might have been being encouraged towards, and or like what this started to look like as we get towards the end of the 20th century, and even up to like how much does this change again? But yeah, either or both of those.
Yeah, so I think careers advice starts to emerge in this mid-20th century moment. And I guess it's partly a combination of, there's like this old idea that like careers are for life. You have a job for life, like you will train for one thing and then that will be what you do forever. But then also this idea that economies are becoming more complicated, like just the sheer number of roles that we need people to do is expanding, and therefore we need new ways to like channel people into these different types of work that are emerging. So careers advice takes different forms. You could have careers advice at school. That's quite patchy across the 20th century and, you know, well into the 21st century. One of the critiques that is often made of schools is that they're not adequately like preparing young people for work, but also like just not advising them and like sufficiently on what kind of jobs are out there. So instead, what you start to get kind of like in the, especially as you move to the 60s and 70s, is more the kind of like self-help version of careers advice. So magazines for young women often contained material on careers. So they would often involve adverts for certain types of careers. So military nursing is like advertised in the pages of magazines, absolutely loads throughout the 60s and 70s. Readers might write to agony aunts, asking about how they get into their chosen careers. There's an amazing run in Jackie magazine in like 1972, I think it is, where for 6 months they run a feature called All in a Day's Work, which is designed to introduce like young women to the different types of careers that are out there. You get guides like this, like Ruth Miller's Careers for Girls, which is like a Penguin handbook, which you could buy, and it kind of gives you a, quote, detailed guide to over 300 careers for women and girls from beautician to barrister, which kind of sets the tone for what's happening. But I think one of the really fascinating things about careers advice is that it mirrors some of the broader changes that we see going on in society at this time in terms of like the changing ways that people think about themselves and about their identities and where they fit into society. So most fundamentally, like underpinning, like the very idea of careers advice is premised around choice. It's premised around the idea that like you as an individual should be able to choose the kind of career that you want and choose the career that fits into your life. Like, what are your personal priorities? Is it earning lots of money? Is it helping people? Like, do you care about social status? Is it more important that your like work fits around your like family or your hobbies or whatever? And so careers advice often gets like pitched in those terms. So in Jackie magazine, for example, in the 1970s, they're working very much with the premise that like its young readers wanted to fall in love and get married. And so even in their careers advice, what they are doing is emphasizing the like potential of certain jobs for marriage prospects. So like military nursing is popular because it means you get to spend lots of time with like young eligible soldiers. Or similarly, like being a secretary is good because it means you can work in like offices with lots of kind of rich and successful and powerful men. So in that sense, careers advice could be it was about like you making choices about your life and what you want from your life and what does your future look like. But at the same time, there's also this idea that like certain people are suited to certain jobs, that like your work isn't just something you do, it relates much more fundamentally to like who you are as a person. So then part of the point of careers advice is to then help people find like work that is a good fit for them. Like it's about individual like psychology and personality as much as it's about like your capacity and formal qualifications. So especially for you, Ted, knowing your interest in the finance sector, I went and had a look at the like careers advice entry relating to careers in the stock exchange and commodity markets. And it suggests that the personal attributes that were needed to succeed in this field were, and I quote, entrepreneurial and gambling instinct, flair for dealing with figures, an extrovert personality, ability to communicate easily on the telephone, personally and in writing, mental agility, quick-wittedness, high powers of concentration, exceptional self-confidence, memory for people and figures, indifference to still being considered an oddity working in a male preserve. So like careers advice is then this like, is performing this really fascinating or trying to support people in doing this really kind of fascinating, like self-management, like trying to tie together, supporting people as they try and tie together, like, what do you need work to do for you, but also who are you as a person, and which jobs out there are going to combine those two things most productively, or like most successfully.
I mean, this is just totally fascinating to me, and I absolutely could talk to you about this all day. And again, spoiler alert for people listening, Hannah and I work in the same building, so probably after we finish recording, I'm going to run downstairs and ask you some more about some of this. But I guess for now, we should probably wrap up in because of time. But I guess the one thing that this really makes me think is how important it is for us all to reflect a little bit on what is it that we imagine for young people, whether that, no matter their gender, and like how important actually the messaging and how we imagine their possible futures ends up being, because that feeds into then all of these other elements that you're talking about like how we conceive of education, how we conceive of advising them about careers, about the kind of potential occupational futures that they might have. So yeah, it's a really fascinating insight into something that I guess when we think of people's working lives, we don't always start the story right back at the beginning, where for a lot of people, their whole kind of idea about what work might look like for them kind of took root. So thank you very much for your time and for giving us a bit of an insight into the like strange and quite intensive, I suppose, world of young people's lives and how young people were encouraged to think about what their futures might look like. So thank you very much for your time, Hannah. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on Women's Business Voice, where women rise, lead, and make an impact. If you loved today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a woman who needs to hear this. Want more inspiration? Visit womensbusiness.club to connect, grow, and be seen. Until next time, keep showing up powerfully. The world needs what only you can bring.